the loop, the take back on the forehand. How big should it be? What should my racket look like when I do it? And why do I need it? Warning, rant incoming. Every now and then I get a client who tells me that they want to have a next-gen forehand, or they tell me their coach teaches the next-gen forehand. And that immediately raises red flags for me. Let me tell you why. Tennis changes at the top of the game very, very fast. The top players set new trends, if I may call them that, every 5 to 10 years. So for instance, a slightly varied take back, elbow leading and the racket face pointing to you, facing to the side fence when you see me from this perspective, might bring benefits to a very elite group of players, let's say high-level college to world-class players of a certain age group. And one could say, well, if they do it and they hit bigger forehands because of that, shouldn't recreational players try to do that? One could say that. I don't. And why don't I say that? Because in my experience, players that force themselves or are forced into a certain swing shape, into a certain form by their coaches, hardly ever get the full benefits of what they're trying to do. And that is because the top players that they're trying to emulate, who spend thousands of hours fine-tuning the ever slightest details, who train countless hours in the gym, who use the absolute latest technology to find the littlest thing that can give them an advantage, because those players are athletic geniuses and because they have impeccable fundamentals on which they built these little details, these slight variations. The fundamentals, the true fundamentals though, stay the same. So why don't recreational players then benefit from these extras? Because quite honestly, they have bigger issues still in the fundamental stages of strokes that if they're starting to add stuff on, it just doesn't work. It makes things more complicated, more difficult, and they just can't do it. Once they have solidified the fundamentals and they don't break down under pressure anymore, we can talk about adding on extras. But when a recreational player of 3-0-3-5-4-0 is telling me they want to get the next gen forehand or whatever is the flavor of the month these days, then it's a little bit like somebody telling me they want to do the same elements that Simone Biles is doing just because they stand next to a balance beam. Rant over. The loop and the take back are of course fundamentals in the forehand, and you do want to get them right. So I'll come back to the questions at the beginning of the video. How big is it? What does my racket look like? And why do I even need it? And I'll start with the why do I even need the loop? If you compare a more modern forehand, the loop, to a very flat, very traditional old school take back and forward swing, the major aspect is that it helps you get topspin on the ball, which helps you to control the depth of the ball and which helps you to stay out of the net. With the modern rackets, with the latest technology, with lighter rackets, by the way, high Yonex, and with great strings, you can swing so fast that if you were to still use the old flat swing, you'd be launching balls right, left, and center. There would be no control. So topspin helps you control the ball and brings it back down so you keep the ball in play. For you to generate topspin, you have to let the racket head drop under the ball and then swing up and forward to your contact point. And that imparts topspin, forward rotation. If you wanted to let the racket head drop, if you're just bringing the racket back flatly, then let it drop, then swing up and forward, that would be really, really choppy. And voila, to enable a rounder and a smoother motion, that is when the loop developed. An added benefit, of course, is if you have a loop on the forehand, you increase the distance in which you can accelerate the racket head. And that, of course, helps with generating topspin. And yes, okay, it gives you a little bit more power too. Now let's move on to the next two questions. How big should my take back be and where should my racket face look when I'm taking my racket back? To the first part there, great answer, it depends. Each ball that you're receiving on your forehand comes in with different depth, speed, spin, height, and also width. So it's an infinite variety of those 5 controls that give you a different ball every single time. So I can only give you a range that's acceptable when we teach the size of the takeback. But the beautiful thing is that that loop will cover most all of these possibilities because you can manipulate the size and the shape of the loop depending on the incoming ball. And you still do it in a very smooth way. For me, my non-dominant hand helps bring that racket back for the turn, but it also lifts the racket so that your dominant hand actually stays between shoulder and hip. Anything too high or too low will probably not help you prepare for the incoming ball in the ideal way. So on the turn here, left hand releases, and now I got my hand between my hip and my shoulder. Of course, if I'm receiving a higher ball, my loop is probably a little higher. My hand, my dominant hand, will most likely be around the upper end of that range. Whereas, of course, if I'm getting a lower ball, I'm not going to take my racket up here. I'm going to start my loop, my take back, a little lower, probably around hip or somewhere in between. So that is the way that you can adjust to different heights. And of course, in this position here, my racket head is above my wrist. And I'm not saying anything yet where that racket is looking to. We'll get to that in a second. But of course, whether I'm up here on the upper range or the lower range of my take back here, I then will let my racket drop below my wrist, below the incoming ball, so that I can swing up and forward to my contact point. And of course, my contact point is also between the hip and the shoulder for best control. How far back am I now taking the racket? You should keep the racket to the right side of your body if you're a right-hander. If you're breaking the plane, you're doing it wrong. Wrong. If we use that very prevalent miss, by the way, also an extreme cookie cutter approach, we would have to tell Naomi Osaka, one of the best forehands ever, that she's hitting a technically flawed forehand, which she doesn't. So if anybody wants to tell you that, please ignore that, because that is putting style over the fundamentals. As long as you're getting into this position, this is called the lock-in position, the butt cap pointing to the incoming ball, or racket lag position, slot-in position, I think I've heard that called too, whatever you want to call it. As long as you get into this position and you're making contact consistently and solid out in front, Bob is your uncle in terms of how far you can take the racket back. You can do a pirouette, I don't care. What should my racket face look like as I'm taking the racket back? Again, if you get into the correct lock-in position, and if, however your racket face looked on the take back, your racket face at contact point is perpendicular to the ground or ever so slightly closed, it doesn't matter how you take your racket back. It does help if on the take back the racket face looks to the outside and looks down to get into the correct contact position. But if you're following all the previous ranges, steps if you will, and you have the correct grip, that will happen anyway. So you don't have to force yourself into very specific degrees of taking the racket back. Your elbow has to be here and here, or if you want to do the Rafa, which also for a time coaches wanted their students to do. If you're trying to force yourself into those swing patterns, into those shapes, you're completely impeding the natural movement that your body and your skill level allow you to do. And guess what? Those forced strokes tend to really break down when you're under pressure. Now that we define the appropriate ranges for the forehand takeback, if you now want to use that forehand to crush your opponent's weaker second serves, check out this video.